On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the guns went quiet across Europe. But scattered across the continent, in forests and on roadsides, and outside ruined factories, thousands of tanks sat exactly where they had stopped. Panthers with their long barrels pointing at nothing. Tiger IIs half buried in mud. Panzer IVs with empty fuel tanks, waiting for crews that were never coming back. The most feared armored fleet in the history of warfare had simply run out of war. The question nobody had thought to answer yet was what happened next. The collapse of Germany's armored force hadn't been sudden. Months of Allied bombing had hammered the factories producing spare parts. Fuel shortages had immobilized vehicles that were mechanically intact. The constant retreat from 1943 onward had turned the logistical system that kept tanks running into something held together with wire and improvisation. By the time Germany signed the surrender documents, the armored force that had torn through France in 6 weeks and driven to the gates of Moscow was a shadow of itself. Hundreds of vehicles scattered across the occupation zones, many deliberately disabled by their own crews before they walked away. German mechanics had smashed engines and gearboxes rather than let them fall into Allied hands intact. What remained was a vast mechanical graveyard stretching from the Rhine to the Oder. Allied forces moved quickly to secure what they found. American technical intelligence teams catalogued vehicles at depots in Oberursel and Geldorf. The British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers units did the same at Hillersleben and Sennelager. Soviet trophy brigades swept across Silesia and into Berlin, tagging and recovering everything they could reach. The condition of what they found varied enormously. Some tanks were almost mechanically intact, worn from use but theoretically operable. Others had been stripped to the frame, radios gone, optics removed, engines pulled to keep other vehicles running in the final weeks. Prototypes and factory-fresh hulls from the last months of production often lacked complete systems because the bombing campaign had disrupted the supply chain before they could be finished. Operational records found in workshops helped Allied teams trace deployment histories, though many documents had been burned in the last days of the regime. Once by the summer of 1945, most of what remained of Germany's armored fleet was sitting in Allied-controlled yards. The immediate question of what to do with it was more complicated than it appeared. The Americans and British wanted to understand what they had been fighting. The German tanks that had given Allied crews so much trouble throughout the war, the Panther with its sloped armor and high-velocity gun, the Tiger with its thick plate and 88mm cannon, the Jagdpanther with its combination of firepower and low profile, had been genuinely formidable opponents, and the engineers who designed Allied armor wanted to know exactly why. Testing programs began almost immediately. For the United States, the center of this effort was Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Beginning in late 1945, the Army shipped examples of the Panther, Tiger I, Tiger II, Jagdpanther, and several assault guns across the Atlantic. American engineers put them through gunnery trials, mechanical stress tests, and armor penetration studies. The results confirmed something Allied tank crews had already learned the hard way. German tanks were exceptionally well armed, and their optics were superb, giving crews the ability to identify and engage targets at ranges where Allied tanks often couldn't see them clearly. But the mechanical picture was more complicated. The final drives and gearboxes on the Panther in particular showed a chronic tendency to fail under sustained operational use, a problem that had plagued German armored units throughout the war and that the Germans had never fully solved. The Tiger II's weight, which gave it nearly impenetrable frontal armor, also made it extraordinarily hard on its running gear and transmission. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were fundamental design compromises that limited how these vehicles could be used in sustained combat operations. The British conducted similar studies, though most of their testing happened inside Germany rather than at home. British engineers compared the Panthers' sloped armor geometry and gun performance directly against the Sherman and Churchill, and their findings aligned with the American conclusions. The German optics were outstanding. The firepower was real, but the maintenance burden under field conditions was severe. Servicing a Panther required specialized tools and trained mechanics in a way that a Sherman, for all its limitations, simply did not. A Sherman crew could do a lot of their own maintenance, so a Panther crew depended on a support infrastructure that Germany increasingly couldn't provide as the war went on. The Soviets approached the captured armor differently. Trophy brigades collected large numbers of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and assault guns, primarily for training purposes rather than systematic technical evaluation. Soviet wartime experience had already taught them what the Americans and British were now confirming in testing facilities: strong frontal armor and high-velocity guns, but mechanical systems that deteriorated quickly under hard use and harsh conditions. The T-34, whatever its limitations in firepower and crew comfort, was fundamentally simpler and more robust than anything Germany had built. By the early 1950s, the most captured German tanks in Soviet hands had been scrapped once the spare parts ran out, and there was no practical way to keep them running. Some of the most significant discoveries came not from intact vehicles, but from the research sites the retreating Germans had left behind. At Kummersdorf and Hillersleben, Allied teams found incomplete hulls and experimental vehicles, elements of the Maus program, the 100-ton super-heavy tank that had never made it past prototype stage, and components of the E-series, Germany's late-war attempt to rationalize tank production into a family of standardized designs that shared common parts. At Haustenbeck, workshops held damaged Jagdtigers awaiting repair alongside Panthers that had been stripped for parts and crates of components that had never been installed. These sites gave Allied engineers a window into what German armor development had been reaching for in the final years of the war, and what it had never managed to achieve. The broader question of what to do with the thousands of tanks that couldn't be usefully studied, the wrecks, the stripped hulls, the vehicles too damaged or incomplete to be worth shipping anywhere, was resolved through a series of Allied Control Council directives issued between 1946 and 1948. German armored vehicles were classified as prohibited materials. They could not remain in German hands. They could not be used for any future rearmament. They had to be destroyed. What followed was demilitarization on an industrial scale. Steel plants in Bochum, Essen, and Magdeburg received long trains of armored hulls delivered from depots across the occupation zones. Workers with cutting torches broke Panthers and Panzer IVs and assault guns into pieces that could be fed into furnaces. Germany in 1946 and 1947 was desperately short of steel for reconstruction. Bridges, factories, and housing all needed metal that wasn't available from any other source. The destroyed armored fleet provided it. The tanks that had rolled through Poland and France and Russia came apart under cutting torches and went into the rebuilding of the country that had built them. By late 1947, hundreds of armored vehicles had been processed this way, leaving almost no trace of what they had been. Not everything went to the furnaces. In rural areas where heavy industrial transport wasn't available, Allied engineers found more direct uses for the hardware. Along the Enns River in Austria, bulldozed Panthers and other vehicles were pushed into riverbank embankments to stabilize them against erosion. Similar practices occurred at quarry sites across Central Europe, where tanks served as fill material for landslide-prone areas. Soil and vegetation covered these vehicles over the following decades, making them effectively part of the landscape. Some of them are still there. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted decades later have found tank-shaped anomalies in embankments and hillsides across former combat zones, the buried remains of vehicles that ended their service lives holding back riverbanks rather than enemy infantry. Another significant portion of surviving German armor became target hulks. The British used tanks at ranges like Lulworth. The Americans used them at Grafenwoehr and Aberdeen. The Soviets used them at various training sites. These vehicles served a practical purpose, letting crews test new ammunition types against actual armor plate, practice gunnery against realistic targets, and evaluate emerging anti-tank technologies against the real thing. Once the firing was done and the hulls were no longer structurally useful, they were either left in place or broken down for scrap. Clearance operations in battle-scarred regions continued for years. Czechoslovak and Polish teams removed wrecks from roadsides, forests, and former defensive lines in areas where the fighting had been heaviest, sending them to scrap yards or incorporating them into land reclamation projects. The physical evidence of the war's final months was methodically removed from the landscape, piece by piece, through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. By 1948, the systematic destruction was largely complete. The myths that occasionally circulate about secret bunkers filled with pristine Panthers or hidden warehouses containing rows of undamaged Tigers waiting to be rediscovered don't survive contact with the documentary record. The available evidence points consistently to misidentified structures and Cold War rumors rather than actual caches of preserved armor. Germany's wartime armored fleet was dismantled with the same industrial efficiency that had produced it. What remained after 1948 was a handful of vehicles preserved for testing, a small number transferred to foreign armies, and the museum pieces that institutions had specifically pulled from the demilitarization stream before it consumed everything. But the story doesn't end with destruction, because a meaningful portion of Germany's surviving armor didn't go to the furnaces at all. It went to war again, under different flags, with different crews, in conflicts that had nothing to do with the war that had produced it. France was among the earliest and most significant post-war users. French forces collected Panthers from depots in southwest Germany and incorporated them into the 503rd Combat Tank Regiment. The decision made sense on paper. The Panthers' firepower and optics were superior to most of what France had available in the immediate post-war period, and the vehicles were simply there, requiring no production and minimal initial investment. So French crews who trained on them were impressed by the same qualities that had made the Panther dangerous in German service. The long 75mm gun could engage targets at ranges where the enemy often couldn't effectively return fire, and the optics made target acquisition under difficult conditions significantly easier than it was in Allied tanks. But the maintenance problems that had plagued the Panther throughout the war followed it into French service with full force. With limited spare parts, worn-out drivetrains, and no longer any German industrial base to draw on, French workshops found themselves cannibalizing multiple vehicles to keep one running. Reports from the early 1950s documented frequent transmission failures. By 1951, France retired the last of its Panthers, and the escalating maintenance costs having made them more trouble than they were worth. The operational window had been short, but long enough to influence how French armored doctrine developed during the critical years when the country was rebuilding its military from almost nothing. Czechoslovakia occupied a unique position in this story because it had been a significant manufacturing center for German armor during the war. After 1945, Czechoslovak factories didn't just collect German tanks, they continued building them. The Hetzer tank destroyer based on the Panzer 38T chassis that Czechoslovakia had been producing since before the war, continued to roll out of factories under the designation G13. Many were sold to Switzerland, which operated them well into the Cold War era. The combination of relatively simple mechanics and reliable engines made the Hetzer attractive to nations that needed capable anti-tank vehicles without the maintenance nightmare of the larger German designs. Switzerland's army found it a practical and cost-effective solution to their armored needs in a way that a Panther or Tiger never could have been. In Eastern Europe, the post-war redistribution of German armor was more ad hoc. Romania operated Panzer IVs for training purposes. Bulgaria integrated a mix of Panzer IVs and assault guns into its early post-war armored units. Yugoslavia received vehicles from various sources. By the mid-1950s, most Eastern European users had transitioned fully to Soviet-supplied T-34s and newer designs. The German vehicles having been retired as spare parts became impossible to source, and Soviet equipment became available through alliance relationships. Spain's involvement with German armor predated the end of the war. In late 1943, Germany had supplied Franco's government with 20 Panzer IVs and 10 assault guns as part of the relationship between the two regimes. These vehicles remained Spain's primary tank into the mid-1950s, operating alongside older equipment from the Spanish Civil War era. As maintenance grew increasingly difficult and the vehicles aged past practical serviceability, the fleet shrank. In 1967, Spain sold 17 surviving Panzer IVs to Syria, a transaction that pushed the operational history of a World War II German tank design into the late 1960s and connected it to a conflict in the Middle East that had no direct relationship to the war that had produced them. Syria turned out to be the most unexpected chapter in the post-war history of German armor. During the 1950s and 1960s, Syria acquired Panzer IVs from both Czechoslovakia and Spain and placed them in frontline units along the Golan Heights. These vehicles remained in Syrian service into the 1970s, representing one of the last known operational uses of a German World War II tank design in active military service. A Panzer IV that had been built for the Wehrmacht sometime in the early 1940s, potentially used by German crews in Russia or North Africa or France, I had somehow survived the war's end. The demilitarization programs, transfer to Spain, sale to Syria, and was still being operated by Syrian crews in the Middle East a quarter century after the war ended. The global circulation of surplus armor in the early Cold War period produced outcomes that nobody designing these vehicles in Germany in the late 1930s could possibly have anticipated. The common thread running through all of these post-war service histories was spare parts. Nations that operated captured German armor all encountered the same fundamental problem at different points in the process. The vehicles were designed for a German industrial ecosystem that no longer existed. The factories that had made Panther final drives and Tiger transmissions were bombed out, dismantled, or converted to other production. The technical manuals were often missing or in a language that maintenance crews couldn't read. The specialized tools required for certain procedures weren't available outside Germany. Countries that operated these tanks found themselves improvising constantly, cannibalizing multiple vehicles to keep one functional, fabricating replacement components from scratch, developing workarounds for procedures the original design assumed would be done with equipment they didn't have. It worked, up to a point. The point it stopped working at was usually determined by how long the drivetrains held out. By the mid-1950s, the operational phase was essentially over. The larger armies had moved to standardized equipment supplied through American or Soviet military assistance programs. So the smaller users had exhausted their spare parts and couldn't source more. The vehicles that had survived, the ones that hadn't been scrapped or destroyed or buried in riverbanks or used as gunnery targets, began their transition from military hardware to historical artifacts. The Tank Museum at Bovington in England assembled what became one of the world's most significant collections of German armor, including one of the few surviving operational Tigers. The Musée des Blindes at Saumur in France built a collection that reflected the variety of vehicles French forces had encountered and captured. The Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow preserved examples that Soviet trophy brigades had recovered, including the only surviving Maus super heavy tank. These institutions ensured that the most significant vehicles from Germany's wartime armored programs would be preserved for study and public access rather than following everything else into the furnaces. What remained after all of it? The testing, the scrapping, the post-war service, the museum collections, was a physical record of something that had been genuinely revolutionary in military terms and genuinely catastrophic in human ones. The German tanks that had redefined armored warfare in 1940 and 1941, that had given Allied tank crews years of painful experience learning how to fight them effectively, had ended their collective existence in steel mills and river embankments and museum display halls and the Golan Heights. The ones that survive in museums are the exceptions to a story of almost total destruction. The handful that were specifically pulled from the demilitarization stream and preserved, while everything else became structural steel for post-war reconstruction or target practice for Cold War gunnery ranges. The Panther that sits in a museum today represents thousands that were cut apart with torches in the Ruhr. The Tiger on display at Bovington is one of a handful that escaped the fate of the rest, broken down, melted down, buried in embankments, or fired at until they were no longer structurally useful. The armored fleet that had once seemed unstoppable had been, in the end, completely stopped. Not by a better tank, though better tanks eventually came. By logistics and fuel shortages and factory bombing and the simple attrition of a war that Germany started and could not finish, and then by the systematic dismantling that followed the surrender, and then by the slow exhaustion of spare parts in the foreign armies that had inherited the survivors. By 1970, the operational history of German World War II armor was over everywhere except Syria, where a few Panzer IVs were still being maintained by crews who had been born after the war that produced them ended. The last chapter of the most feared armored force in history was written not in Russia or Normandy or the Ardennes, but on the Golan Heights, in tanks built for a different war, operated by soldiers of a country that hadn't existed when those tanks rolled off the assembly line. Subscribe and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.